Good morning everyone and welcome to lecture 5 on IAS 37. For the past 4 lectures you have watched videos created by Nadia, who was the academic trainee in 2017, and in today's video, video 5, I'm just going to provide you with a quick summary and overview of IAS 37. So basically IAS 37 in under 10 minutes. So the first thing that we need to know and understand from IAS 37 is the definitions. Now IAS 37 deals specifically with provisions, contingent liabilities, and contingent assets. Now a provision is a liability of uncertain timing or amount. Now when you watched lecture video 1, you would have heard Nadia talk about the definition of a liability, and the definition of a liability that she spoke about is different to the definition of a liability that you now know today. That is because the conceptual framework has been updated and you guys have learned the updated conceptual framework. However, IAS 37 is still based on the old conceptual framework, and therefore the old liability definition is applicable. We then have contingent liabilities, and now there are 2 different definitions of contingent liabilities. The first definition is a possible obligation that arises from past events whose existence will be confirmed by the occurrence or non-occurrence of uncertain future events that are not within the control of the entity. The second definition of a contingent liability is a present obligation that does arise from past events, but which is not recognized as it is not probable that an outflow of economic resources will be required to settle the obligation, or because the amount of the obligation cannot be measured. And then lastly, we have contingent assets. And contingent assets are possible assets that arise from past events whose existence will be confirmed by the occurrence or non-occurrence of uncertain future events which are not within the control of the entity. Now you will see on the slide that I have underlined certain parts of the definition. If you are asked to discuss and classify something in terms of IAS 37, the underlined bits are the points that you need to apply. You need to find information in the scenario to apply to the fact that this is a possible obligation, that there was a past event, that there is an event, an uncertain event which could or could not occur in the future, and that this event is not within the control of the entity, for example. So the underlined bits are the points that you need to apply. Let's now look at the treatment of a provision. So we can only recognize a provision when we have a present legal or constructive obligation to forfeit economic resources. Economic resources, cash, and things alike. Now, what is a legal obligation? A legal obligation is when another party has the right to force you to perform. The obligation is therefore enforced by law. A constructive obligation, on the other hand, is not legally enforceable, and you have to perform in terms of this obligation due to external factors or policies that have maybe been undertaken by management. So under a constructive obligation, the circumstances in which you find yourself in gives rise to the obligation. Okay. It also needs to be probable that there will be an outflow of economic resources to settle the obligation. So as an entity, we will lose something in order to get rid of the obligation. And we need to have a reliable estimate of what this outflow of economic resources will be. That then brings us to measurement. The measurement needs to be the best estimate of the amount that will be required to settle the obligation. If there are a range of outcomes, you need to use the midpoint of these outcomes. And then if there is a significant discounting component, then we need to recognize the provision as the present value. Now, if there is a right of recovery, you do not offset the amount that can be recovered against the provision. You have to recognize a separate asset for the amount that can be recovered. Okay. And then, of course, the amount that you will recover will be limited to the provision. So the separate asset cannot exceed the amount of the provision, which is recognized as a liability. Next up, we look at the treatment of contingent liabilities. Now, importantly, contingent liabilities are never, ever, ever recognized in your financial statements. We disclose a contingent liability, but it is not recognized. Now, when we disclose our contingent liability, we need to give a brief description of the nature of the contingent liability. We need to give an estimate of the financial effect. We need to state whether there are any uncertainties relating to the timing or the amount. And then we need to state whether there is a possibility of reimbursement. Now, because we need to disclose an estimate of the financial effect, that means we need to measure the contingent liability. So when we measure the contingent liability, we need to give the best estimate of the amount that will actually be needed in order to settle the obligation if the obligation does actually materialize. Because remember, contingent liability is not recognized in the financial statements simply because it's either a possible obligation, which means there's uncertainty about whether the obligation actually exists, or because it's an actual obligation, but there's uncertainty relating to the resources that need to be utilized or the amount of the obligation. All right. And then if there is a significant financing component, then we need to discount the estimate to its present value. And then lastly, we have our treatment of our contingent assets. Now, once again, we do not recognize a contingent asset in our financial statements just because they are possible assets that arise from past events and their existence will only be confirmed in the future. However, what it is important to understand is that a contingent asset could lead to the realization of income, and we postpone the recognition of this income until it is virtually certain that we will actually receive this income. And when the realization of income is virtually certain, it is no longer a contingency, but we can now go and recognize an actual asset. So, because we do not recognize contingent assets in our financial statements, we know that we need to disclose contingent assets in our notes to the financial statements. And if there is an inflow of economic benefits that is probable, it is important that we provide a description of the nature as well as an estimate of the financial effect. And because we have to provide an estimate of the financial effect, we therefore need to go and look at measurement. So when we look at measurement, we need the best estimate of the amount that could possibly be received if the asset does actually materialize. That then brings us to the end of your crash course on IAS 37. We just looked at the basic important principles of IAS 37 being definitions and treatments. What we did not cover is the concepts of onerous contracts and executory contracts. So please go and take a look in your IAS 37 standard in your IFRS, as well as your notes and examples in your introduction to IFRS. Have a great afternoon. Bye.